They skipped Mother's Day, and I told myself not to take it to heart, because that's what mothers like me do. We make excuses for everyone else while quietly swallowing our own pain. The day arrived with flowers everywhere except my door, phones buzzing everywhere except my table, and I sat there, with my tea going cold, staring at old photos, remembering the years I stayed awake through fevers, exams, heartbreaks, and hard times, convincing myself that love doesn't need reminders, that maybe they were busy, maybe next hour, maybe tomorrow. But tomorrow came and went just like that day, empty. And silent, and in that silence I felt smaller than I ever had, like my role in their lives had slowly faded into something optional. Days later, when the phone finally rang, my heart still jumped like it always does, because no matter how hurt a mother is, hope never fully leaves, but the voice on the other end didn't ask how I was, didn't say sorry, didn't even mention Mother's Day. It went straight to money, to needs, to urgency. And in that moment something inside me cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, because I realized I wasn't forgotten. I was simply remembered only when I was useful. I listened quietly as they explained their problems, my fingers tightening around the phone, my chest heavy with all the words I'd never said, all the sacrifices I'd never counted, all the love I'd given without conditions. And for the first time in my life, I didn't rush to fix things. I didn't say, "Don't worry." I didn't say, "I'll manage." Because I was tired of being strong in silence, tired of being generous at the cost of my dignity, tired of teaching others how to treat me by accepting less than I deserved. So I took a breath, felt the weight of years pressing against my heart, and I spoke calmly, firmly, not with anger, but with clarity, telling them that love without respect is not love, that I am not a bank, that I am a mother who also needs to feel seen, valued, and remembered without a reason. And when I said no, when I chose myself for once, the shock on the other end was louder than any Mother's Day greeting could have been, because they had never imagined a version of me that set boundaries, that protected her heart, that understood her worth beyond what she could give. I ended the call with tears in my eyes but strength in my spine, realizing that sadness doesn't always mean weakness. Sometimes it's the beginning of self-respect, and even though that house still feels quiet and some days the loneliness creeps in, I remind myself that I raised them with love, and now I owe that same love to myself, because a mother's heart may bend, may ache, may forgive endlessly, but it should never be forgotten. And that day, the real shock wasn't what I said to them, it was what I finally said to myself. After that call ended, the house felt different, not quieter but heavier, like the walls themselves were processing what had just happened, and I sat there for a long time holding the phone as it might ring again with an apology, an explanation, anything that would soften the ache. But it didn't, and that silence forced me to face a truth I had avoided for years, that I had taught them to expect my sacrifices without ever acknowledging my feelings. I replayed moments from the past, times I skipped my own needs so theirs could come first, the nights I prayed for their safety while they slept peacefully, the pride I felt watching them grow even when it meant growing apart from myself. And with every memory came a mix of love and grief, because love doesn't disappear just because respect is missing, it just becomes heavier to carry. Days passed and no one called back, not to argue, not to understand, and that hurt in a way I wasn't prepared for, because it confirmed what I feared, that my no had unsettled them more than my sadness ever had. Yet in that pain something unexpected happened. I began noticing myself again, my own routines, my own thoughts, the quiet strength that had always been there but never acknowledged, and I realized how long I had lived on emotional autopilot, responding to everyone else's needs while ignoring my own exhaustion. Some nights I cried myself to sleep, not because I regretted what I said, but because I wished it hadn't taken this long to say it, and other nights I slept peacefully for the first time in years, because my heart finally felt honest. I questioned myself constantly. Was I being selfish? Was I being cold? Was I failing as a mother? But deep down I knew boundaries are not rejection, they are protection, and even mothers deserve protection. I began to understand that love should not feel like a transaction, that care given out of guilt slowly turns into resentment, and that respect cannot be demanded only when it's convenient. Eventually, a message came, short and awkward, not apologetic but cautious, and I could sense their confusion, their disbelief that I hadn't immediately softened, and instead of rushing to reassure them. I let the message sit because healing doesn't happen on someone else's timeline. It happens when you're ready. I started spending time doing things I once postponed, drinking my tea while it was still hot, taking slow walks, breathing without pressure, and with each small act of self-care, I felt less invisible to myself. I still miss them because a mother's heart never fully detaches, but now that love exists alongside self-respect, not in place of it, and if they ever truly come back, not for money, not for favors, but for connection, I'll welcome that with open arms and clearer boundaries. Until then, I am learning to sit with my sadness without letting it define me, to accept that sometimes the shock others feel is simply the result of you finally choosing yourself. And maybe one day they'll understand that the greatest lesson I ever taught them wasn't sacrifice, but self-worth. As time continued to move forward, I realized healing isn't a straight road. It circles back on itself, some days gentle and some days unbearably sharp. And there were mornings I woke up strong, convinced I had done the right thing, and evenings when the loneliness sat beside me like an old friend who refused to leave. I found myself missing not just them, but the version of myself I used to be, the woman who believed unconditional giving would automatically turn into unconditional love, the mother who thought endurance was the same as strength. But slowly I began to understand that endurance without appreciation slowly erodes the soul, and that lesson settled into me with both pain and clarity. I noticed how often society praises mothers for sacrificing everything yet rarely asks who catches them when they fall, and that realization made me feel less alone and more awake, because my story wasn't unique. It was quietly shared by countless women who learned too late that love should not require self-erasure. Sometimes I imagined what I would say if they truly listened, how I would explain that I never wanted perfection, just presence, never demanded grand gestures, only remembrance, and how forgetting Mother's Day wasn't the wound itself, but the symbol of how easily my emotional needs were overlooked. Weeks passed, and conversations slowly restarted, careful and guarded, filled with pauses and unsaid words, and I could feel them adjusting to this unfamiliar version of me, the one who didn't immediately give in, the one who asked questions instead of offering solutions. And though that distance hurt, it also felt necessary, like resetting a balance that had been tilted for years. There were moments when guilt tried to pull me back into old patterns, whispering that a good mother would bend again, but I learned to answer that voice gently, reminding myself that goodness is not measured by how much you give up, but by how honestly you live. I started finding comfort in small victories, in saying no without explaining myself, in choosing rest without apology, in understanding that my worth doesn't decrease just because I'm no longer endlessly available. When I looked in the mirror, I saw sadness, yes, but also resilience etched into every line, proof of a life lived deeply, and I made peace with the idea that being misunderstood is sometimes the price of growth. I still hope for a day when they look back and recognize the quiet courage it took for me to finally speak up, when they understand that the shock they felt wasn't betrayal but transformation. And until that day comes, I continue walking forward, carrying both love and boundaries in the same heart, knowing now that I can be a mother who loves fiercely without losing herself, and that realization, slow, painful, and liberating, is the truest gift I have ever given myself. With even more time passing, I began to see my story not as a moment of conflict, but as a quiet turning point, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly yet changes the direction of everything that follows. And I noticed how my days slowly stopped revolving around waiting for calls, waiting for validation, waiting to feel needed, and instead began revolving around living, even if that living was simple and sometimes lonely. There were afternoons when memories would suddenly ambush me, the sound of their laughter when they were younger, the way they used to run toward me without hesitation. And in those moments my heart would ache so deeply that I had to sit down and let the tears come, not because I wanted to go back, but because grieving the past is part of accepting the present. I learned that sadness doesn't mean I made the wrong choice. It means I loved deeply, and loving deeply always leaves marks. Yet alongside that sadness grew a steady sense of dignity, a feeling I hadn't realized I had been missing for years. Conversations with them became more real, less transactional, sometimes awkward, sometimes distant, but no longer one-sided, and even when they tested my boundaries, I stayed calm, not defensive, because peace is louder than arguments ever were. There were days I questioned whether they truly understood me yet, but I stopped chasing understanding, because growth taught me that clarity doesn't need permission. I also began noticing other women around me, neighbors, relatives, strangers, carrying the same quiet exhaustion behind polite smiles, and my heart softened for all of us, for the way we were taught to pour endlessly without ever checking if the cup was refilled. And in that shared understanding, I found strength, knowing my pain was not a failure, but a reflection of how much I had given. I started speaking more honestly, not just with them, but with myself, acknowledging my limits, honoring my needs, and forgiving myself for the years I believed love meant silence. Sometimes the loneliness still visits, especially on days meant for celebration, but now it doesn't define me. It simply reminds me that choosing yourself can feel isolating before it feels empowering. I don't know how our relationship will look in the future, whether it will fully heal or remain cautiously distant, but I know this much. I am no longer invisible in my own life, and that alone feels like a quiet victory. If they ever truly see me, not as a provider or a solution, but as a human being with emotions, boundaries, and worth, I will welcome that with an open heart. But even if they don't, I will continue forward with grace, because this chapter of my life is no longer about proving my love. It's about preserving it, and in learning to protect my heart, I finally learned what real strength looks like. As this new chapter kept unfolding, I slowly understood that choosing myself was not a single decision but a daily practice, one that required patience, courage, and forgiveness toward the woman I used to be, because there were still moments when old habits tried to return, when I almost picked up the phone to offer help before being asked, when guilt whispered that love should always come at a cost. But each time I paused, breathed, and reminded myself that love given freely should never feel like self-betrayal, I began reflecting on how many years I measured my worth by how indispensable I was, how needed, how available, and how painful it was to realize that being constantly needed had slowly erased the parts of me that once dreamed, rested, and laughed without worry. Yet with that realization came compassion for myself, because I knew I had done the best I could with what I believed back then, and growth doesn't happen without first unlearning. My relationship with them continued to shift in small, uneven steps, sometimes warmer, sometimes distant, and I learned not to read every silence as rejection or every pause as punishment. Because people also struggle when dynamics change, especially when they were never taught how to show appreciation without expectation. There were days I felt proud of how far I had come, how calmly I could now say no, how clearly I could express my feelings without trembling, and other days when the weight of being a mother pressed heavy on my chest, reminding me that detachment is never complete, that love still lives there, quietly, stubbornly, faithfully. I accepted that my sadness and my strength could coexist, that I didn't have to choose between being soft and being firm, and this balance slowly became my anchor. I started finding meaning in sharing my story, even if only in my own thoughts, because naming pain gives it shape, and shaped pain no longer controls you in the dark. Sometimes I imagined another woman listening, another mother sitting alone with her tea going cold, believing she was wrong for wanting more than silence and obligation, and I hoped my journey might remind her that self-respect is not rebellion, it is survival. I no longer waited for special days to feel valued, no longer marked my calendar with expectations that others might forget, and instead I began creating quiet rituals for myself, moments of acknowledgement that didn't depend on anyone else remembering me, and in doing so, I realized something profound, that the shock they felt when I changed was never about money. It was about losing access to a version of me that gave endlessly without question. I don't resent them for that anymore, because resentment would keep me tied to the past, and I am learning to live forward, gently, intentionally, with a heart that still loves deeply but now knows its limits. Whatever the future holds, reconciliation or distance, closeness or clarity, I know that I am no longer shrinking to keep peace, no longer silencing myself to avoid discomfort, and that growth, though lonely at times, has given me something priceless. a sense of self that cannot be taken away. This story may have begun with a forgotten Mother's Day and a painful phone call, but it continues as a reminder that even the most selfless hearts deserve care, and that sometimes the greatest shock you give the world is simply standing up for your own worth. As I sit with everything that has happened, I realize that this journey has quietly reshaped the way I see love, family, and myself, and while the pain hasn't vanished, it has softened into understanding, the kind that doesn't excuse hurtful behavior but no longer lets it define my worth. I've learned that motherhood does not end when children grow up, but it does change, and sometimes that change feels like loss before it feels like balance, because no one prepares you for the moment when being needed every day turns into being remembered only when convenient. There are still days when I catch myself wondering if they miss me the way I miss them, if they ever pause and think about how my silence now is different from before, not heavy with unspoken sacrifice but steady with self-respect, and those thoughts still sting, but they no longer break me. I've begun to accept that people often recognize value only after access is limited, and while that realization hurts, it has also freed me from constantly proving my love through giving. I no longer feel the urge to explain my boundaries or justify my decisions, because I understand now that those who truly care will make the effort to understand without demanding proof, and those who don't were never listening in first place. Sometimes I look back at the woman I was and feel a deep tenderness for her, for how hard she tried to keep everyone happy, how quietly she endured disappointment, how she mistook patience for invisibility, and instead of judging her, I thank her because she carried me to this point, where I finally learned to stand on my own emotional ground. The loneliness still comes in waves, especially during moments meant for celebration, but now I let it pass without fighting it, knowing that loneliness is not the absence of love, but the space where self-discovery grows. I've started finding comfort in my own presence, in the quiet routines that once felt empty but now feel grounding, and I've learned that peace does not always come from reconciliation. Sometimes it comes from acceptance. If they come back with understanding, I will meet them with honesty and care, but if they don't, I will still move forward without bitterness, because holding on to resentment would only reopen wounds I've worked so hard to heal. This story is no longer just about a forgotten Mother's Day or a shocking phone call. It's about a woman who learned, late but not too late, that love should never cost her dignity, that giving should never erase her identity, and that even a sad auntie, worn down by years of quiet sacrifice, can still choose herself and rewrite the ending. And as I continue walking this path, I do so with a heart that remains open but no longer unguarded, carrying both compassion and strength, knowing that my worth does not depend on who remembers me, but on how deeply I finally learn to remember myself. As this journey stretches further, I've come to understand that healing is not about reaching a place where nothing hurts anymore, but about reaching a place where hurt no longer controls your choices, and this realization has changed how I wake up each morning and how I sit with myself at night, because I am no longer scanning the silence for proof of my importance. I think often about how quietly mothers disappear into their roles, how years pass with everyone knowing what we give but few asking what we feel, and how easily that becomes normal until one small moment, one forgotten day, one careless call, forces everything into the light. I still love them, that truth has not changed and never will, but love now lives beside discernment, not blind hope, and I have learned that it is possible to care deeply without abandoning yourself in the process. There are moments when they reach out cautiously, unsure of where they stand with this version of me, and instead of rushing to reassure them, I allow space for honesty, because relationships built on truth may feel uncomfortable at first, but they don't collapse under pressure. I notice how my voice no longer shakes when I speak my needs, how my silence is no longer an apology, and how powerful it feels to sit with my emotions instead of immediately trying to resolve everyone else's. Sometimes I grieve the fantasy I once held, that love alone could fix everything, that if I just gave enough, tried harder, stayed quieter, things would naturally balance out. But letting go of that fantasy has made room for a more grounded kind of peace, one that doesn't rely on constant validation. I have also learned to forgive myself for the anger that sometimes surfaces, because anger is not cruelty. It is clarity arriving late, and instead of pushing it away, I listen to what it's trying to teach me about my limits. The world still moves on with its celebrations and expectations, and there are days I feel invisible within it, but now invisibility doesn't scare me the way it used to, because I know who I am even when no one is watching. I've begun to see my story as a quiet testimony, not of bitterness, but of awakening, a reminder that even those who spend a lifetime giving can't choose to stop and still be worthy of love. If my children ever truly understand this chapter of my life, I hope they see not rejection but courage, not punishment but growth. And if they don't, I will still hold my head high, because my healing does not require their permission. This 7th chapter is less dramatic than the first, less sharp than the pain that started it all. But it is deeper, steadier, and more honest. And it reminds me every day that my value was never tied to being remembered on special occasions or being useful in moments of need. It was always there, quietly, waiting for me to finally recognize it, and now that I have, I carry that truth forward with calm resolve, knowing that my story is still being written, but at last I am writing it for myself. As I move into this 8th part of my story, I feel a different kind of calm settling into me, not the calm that comes from everything being perfect, but the calm that comes from acceptance, from knowing that I can survive discomfort without losing myself, and that realization has quietly changed the rhythm of my life. I no longer measure my days by who called or who didn't, who remembered or who forgot, because I've learned that constantly waiting for others to validate your existence slowly drains the joy out of living, and I refuse to live like that anymore. There are still moments when memories surface without warning, shared meals, late-night talks, small traditions that once made me feel central to their world. And when they do, I allow myself to feel the sadness fully instead of brushing it aside, because honoring grief is part of honoring love, and denying it would only keep me stuck. Yet alongside that grief is a growing sense of steadiness, a belief that my life still holds meaning beyond the roles I've played for others, and that belief has become my quiet strength. I've started noticing how much emotional energy I used to spend managing everyone else's expectations, and how freeing it feels to redirect even a fraction of that care inward, to check in with my own heart the way I once checked in with theirs. Conversations with them now exist in a new space, one where I listen without overextending, where I respond without overpromising. And while that distance sometimes feels awkward, it also feels honest, like we are finally meeting each other as individuals rather than obligations. I've learned that relationships don't always fall apart when boundaries are introduced. Some simply reveal what they were built on, and whatever survives that revelation is worth nurturing, while whatever doesn't was never meant to carry the weight of your soul. There are days when I catch myself smiling for no particular reason, and those moments surprise me the most, because they remind me that happiness doesn't always come from resolution. Sometimes it comes from release, from letting go of the need to be everything for everyone. I've also become more gentle with my expectations, understanding that healing doesn't require closure in the traditional sense, and that unanswered questions don't have to become open wounds if you stop pressing on them. As a mother, as an auntie, as a woman who spent years putting herself last, I am learning that choosing peace is not selfish, it is necessary, and that caring for yourself does not diminish the love you have for others. It simply makes that love healthier. I don't know how many chapters this story will have, or how it will eventually be read by those who were once at its center, but I know that this chapter is marked by a quiet confidence, a sense that I no longer need to explain myself to be understood, or prove my worth to be valued. If someone listening to my story recognizes herself in these words, I hope she knows that it's never too late to step out of emotional neglect and into self-respect, that sadness does not cancel strength, and that even after years of giving, it is okay to pause and choose yourself. This 8th part is not about closure or victory. It is about continuity, about living with an open heart and clear boundaries at the same time. And as I continue forward, I do so knowing that my life is no longer defined by what was taken for granted, but by what I finally learned to protect: my dignity, my peace, and the quiet, unwavering knowledge of my own worth.